Episode 1: Data Basics and Types. Q1: What kinds of data do you usually work with day to day? Mostly a mix, honestly. Sometimes I'm looking at available data that's already been collected by someone else, and other times I'm pulling raw data straight from a source before it's been cleaned up at all. The raw version is always messier than people expect, full of gaps and inconsistencies you have to sort through first. Q2: How do you decide whether historical data is still useful for a current problem? It depends on how much the underlying situation has changed. Historical data can be incredibly useful for spotting long-term patterns, but I've also seen people lean on it too heavily when conditions have shifted so much that the old numbers barely apply anymore. I try to treat it as context, not a direct prediction. Q3: What do you do when you find missing data in the middle of an analysis? Honestly, it happens more often than I'd like. When I hit missing data, my first instinct used to be to just estimate and move on, but now I flag it explicitly instead, because pretending a gap doesn't exist can quietly distort the whole conclusion later. Q4: How do you make sure the numerical data you're using is actually reliable? I usually cross-check against a second source if one exists. Numerical data looks authoritative just because it's a number, but numbers can be wrong just as easily as words. I try to hold onto a healthy skepticism, especially with figures that conveniently support whatever I already believed going in. Q5: What separates preliminary data from something you'd actually trust for a final decision? Preliminary data is really just an early signal, useful for deciding whether something's worth investigating further, but risky to act on directly. I've learned not to get too attached to early numbers, since they often shift once a proper sample size builds up. Q6: What makes survey data particularly tricky to interpret? Survey data depends entirely on how honestly people answer, and people aren't always honest, even with themselves. I've seen results skew heavily just because of how a question was phrased. It's why I always want to see the actual questions before trusting the summary someone hands me. On top of that, I always want to be looking at genuinely relevant data and reliable data before drawing anything from it. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 2: Research Process and Methodology. Q1: Have you ever had to conduct a survey yourself? What was that like? Yes, once, for a small internal project. Getting people to actually conduct a survey properly, clear questions, no leading language, turned out to be much harder than I expected. Half the effort went into wording the questions so they wouldn't quietly bias the answers. Q2: How important is choosing the right research methodology before you start? Enormously important, and something I underestimated early on. Picking the wrong research methodology at the start can waste months, because the kind of data you need shapes everything else: how you collect it, how you analyze it, even what conclusions are possible at the end. Q3: How do you decide on a research topic when several options seem interesting? I usually pick the research topic that has the least existing clarity, the questions nobody's fully answered yet. It's tempting to chase something exciting, but if there's no real gap, you end up repeating previous research rather than adding something new. Q4: Is recent research always more trustworthy than older studies? Not automatically, no. Recent research benefits from newer tools and data, which is genuinely valuable, but that doesn't make it immune to bias or small sample sizes. I try to weigh the quality of the study itself, not just how recent the publication date is. Q5: What's the difference between qualitative research and quantitative analysis in practice? Qualitative research captures nuance, why people feel or behave a certain way, while quantitative analysis is about measuring how much or how often. I think the best studies usually combine both, because numbers alone miss the story, and stories alone can't be generalized reliably. Q6: How do you know if scientific research and its statistical significance actually means something important? This trips people up a lot. Scientific research can report statistical significance on a result that's technically real but practically meaningless, a tiny effect detected in a huge sample. I always ask not just, is this significant, but does this actually matter in the real world? Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 3: Analyzing and Interpreting. Q1. What's your process when you need to interpret data that looks contradictory at first? I slow down instead of forcing an explanation immediately. When I interpret data that seems to contradict itself, it's usually because I'm missing a variable, not because the data is actually wrong. Taking the contradiction seriously, rather than explaining it away too fast, has saved me from bad conclusions more than once. Q2. How do you process data efficiently without cutting corners? I try to automate the repetitive parts so I can spend more attention on the parts that actually require judgment. When you process data by hand for something large, small errors creep in just from fatigue. Automation, even something simple, cuts that risk significantly. Q3. What's the best way to present data to people who aren't specialists? Simplify without distorting, basically. When I present data to a general audience, I try to keep the core message intact even as I drop technical detail. It's easy to accidentally mislead people by oversimplifying, so I'm careful about which details are safe to cut. Q4. How do you record data in a way that your future self will actually understand? I learned this one the hard way. Early on, I didn't record data with enough context, just numbers, no notes on what they meant or how they were collected, and 6 months later I had no idea how to interpret my own file. Q5. When you report findings, how honest should you be about the study's weaknesses? Completely honest, in my view. When you report findings, burying the limitations just sets up whoever reads it next to misuse the results. I'd rather flag every weak point up front than have someone build a bad decision on shaky ground because I left something out. Q6. How do you identify a genuine causal relationship instead of just a coincidence? That's genuinely one of the hardest parts of analysis. A real causal relationship requires ruling out other explanations, not just observing that two things move together. I try to isolate the independent variable carefully and stay suspicious of any conclusion that arrived too easily, along with any random variable that might be quietly influencing the outcome, or even a subtle chemical reaction in a physical experiment that no one accounted for. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 4: Science, Curiosity, and Understanding. Q1. Is there a scientific topic involving genetic variation that you find especially interesting? Yes, actually, how much genetic variation exists even within what looks like a uniform population fascinates me. It's a reminder that averages hide a huge amount of individual difference, something that matters far beyond biology too. Q2. How do experimental results usually differ from what researchers initially expect? More often than you'd think, honestly. Experimental results frequently surprise the very people running the study, which is part of what makes research worthwhile. If you already knew the answer, you wouldn't need the experiment. Q3. What does it mean for a study to be carefully controlled, and why does that matter? A carefully controlled study isolates the one thing you're actually testing, ruling out other explanations as much as possible. Without that discipline, you might notice a common feature across your results and mistakenly assume it caused the outcome, when it was really just coincidence. Q4. How do you build a comprehensive overview of a topic you're unfamiliar with? I start broad before narrowing. Building a genuinely comprehensive overview means reading enough different sources that you start noticing where they actually disagree, not just repeating whatever the first article told you. Q5. Is it possible to fully understand a complex topic quickly, or does it always take time? Honestly, I think real depth takes time, no matter how smart the shortcut feels. You can grasp the basics fast, but to fully understand something, you usually have to sit with the confusion for a while before it clicks. Q6. What keeps you motivated to explore further once you've already found a satisfying answer? Curiosity, mostly the sense that the first answer is rarely the whole picture. I try to explore further even when I've technically got what I need, because that's usually where the most interesting, fairly straightforward seeming assumptions turn out to hide an underlying reason nobody noticed, one that might directly affect the whole conclusion. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 5. Information and Access. Q1. How do you decide what counts as additional information versus unnecessary detail? I ask whether it changes the decision at hand. If a piece of additional information wouldn't actually shift what someone does next, I usually leave it out. Even if it's technically interesting, clarity matters more than completeness. Q2. How much background knowledge do you think people need before joining a discussion on a technical topic? Enough to follow the logic, not necessarily enough to have built it themselves. I try not to assume too much background knowledge when I explain something, because it's easy to forget how much context I've built up that others simply haven't had yet. Q3. Should information always have easy access, or are there good reasons to limit it? It depends on sensitivity. Most information benefits from easy access. It speeds up decisions and builds trust. But some things genuinely need limited access, especially anything involving personal data, where openness could actually cause harm rather than help. Q4. What do you do when you don't have access to information you clearly need? I try to be direct about asking rather than guessing. If I don't have access to something essential, working around it usually wastes more time than simply requesting it properly, even if that feels slower in the moment. Q5. How do you store information so it stays useful months or years later? Consistency matters more than cleverness here. I try to store information using the same simple structure every time, because a clever one-off system I invent today is something future me will have completely forgotten how to use. Q6. Is it better to share information early and often, or wait until you're fully sure? I lean towards sharing early, with caveats attached. Waiting to share information until it's perfectly certain often means sharing it too late to be useful, and if I need to seek information further before finalizing, I'd rather say that out loud than let people assume more confidence than I actually have. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 6. Engagement and Contribution. Q1. What made you first become involved in research or analytical work? Honestly, it was almost accidental. I needed data for a small project and ended up genuinely curious about the process. Once you become involved in asking good questions, it's hard to go back to just accepting numbers at face value. Q2. How do you get people who aren't naturally analytical to get involved in a data-driven project? I try to connect the data to something they already care about. People get involved in analysis much faster when they can see it answering a question that actually affects their own work, not just an abstract exercise. Q3. What kind of activity helps someone build real analytical skills, in your opinion? Practice with messy, real data beats textbook examples every time. When you genuinely engage in an activity involving actual uncertainty, contradictions, gaps, ambiguity, you learn far more than from a clean, tidy dataset built for a lesson. Q4. How do you create opportunities for less experienced colleagues to learn analysis on the job? I try to hand over small, low-risk pieces of a bigger project rather than keeping all the interesting work to myself. It's a simple way to create opportunities without putting anyone in over their head too early. Q5. What's a contribution you're proud of making to a project that wasn't originally yours? There was a project where I noticed an assumption nobody had questioned, and pointing it out ended up reshaping the whole approach. Being able to make a contribution like that, even from the sidelines, felt more satisfying than leading a project outright. Q6. Do you think giving feedback publicly helps or hurts a team's willingness to engage honestly? It depends heavily on tone. When people give feedback constructively, it builds trust and raises public awareness of shared standards. Done carelessly, though, public feedback can just make people defensive and quieter next time, which defeats the whole purpose. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 7. Performance and Impact. Q1. What's the clearest sign that a change actually led to improved performance? Consistency over time, mostly. A single good result could be luck, but improved performance that holds steady across several cycles is much harder to explain away as coincidence. Q2. Can a small, simple change ever have a great impact on a project's outcome? Surprisingly often, yes. I've seen one small fix have a great impact far beyond what its size suggested. Sometimes the tiniest bottleneck is quietly limiting everything downstream of it. Q3. How do you know when a finding actually carries great significance, rather than just sounding impressive? I ask whether it would change a real decision. A result can sound dramatic, but carry no great significance in practice if nothing would actually be done differently because of it. Q4. What's an example of a decision that had a profound impact on how your team works now? Switching to shorter, more frequent check-ins instead of one long weekly meeting had a genuinely profound impact. Smaller problems got caught before they compounded, and people stopped saving up frustration for a single tense conversation. Q5. How do you know a tool is genuinely a powerful tool and not just popular? I look at what it lets people do that they couldn't do easily before. A truly powerful tool creates a significant effect on how a team works, not just a marginal convenience dressed up as innovation. Q6. What's usually the main source of delay in a research project, in your experience? Almost always waiting on other people's input, honestly, not the analysis itself. Identifying the main source of delay early and figuring out which major component of the timeline actually depends on someone else saves a huge amount of frustration later. It also tends to reveal which key area genuinely needs more attention than it's getting. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 8. Scale and Degree. Q1. How do you talk about a high concentration of something without sounding overly technical? I try to translate it into something relatable. Instead of saying high concentration, I'll describe what that actually looks or feels like in practice, since raw technical framing tends to lose a general audience fast. Q2. When does a high proportion of something become worth worrying about? It depends entirely on context. A high proportion of errors in a low-stakes task might be fine, while the same proportion somewhere critical is alarming. Even a seemingly small but high percentage shift can matter a lot once you multiply it across a large enough group, so I try not to react to the number alone without asking what it actually represents. Q3. How do you handle a huge amount of information without feeling overwhelmed? I break it into stages rather than trying to absorb a huge amount of material all at once. Even a substantial amount of reading feels manageable once it's split across several sittings instead of one long, exhausting session. Q4. Is a vast range of options always better when you're choosing a tool or method? Not necessarily. A vast range of choices can slow you down more than help. I usually narrow things to 2 or 3 strong candidates early, rather than seriously comparing every possible option available. Q5. What do you do when a task starts becoming increasingly difficult the deeper you go? I check whether the difficulty is genuinely necessary or just a sign I've missed something simpler. Something relatively high in perceived difficulty sometimes has an easier path hiding underneath it, especially if it only became increasingly difficult after one small wrong assumption early on. Q6. How do you make sure the initial stage of a project sets things up properly for a given period ahead? I try to overinvest early, even when it feels slow. Getting the initial stage right, over a clearly defined given period, saves far more time later than rushing to look productive on day one, even when a result looks only slightly different from what you expected at first. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 9. Presentation and Communication of Findings. Q1. What makes an oral presentation of research actually land with an audience? Honestly, restraint. A good oral presentation resists the urge to include everything. It picks the few points that matter most and lets the rest live in a written appendix instead. Q2. How do you keep the primary focus clear when a presentation covers a lot of ground? I anchor everything back to one central question and treat every other point as supporting evidence. If the primary focus ever gets fuzzy, the whole talk starts to feel like a list rather than an argument. Q3. Should you avoid technical terms entirely when speaking to a general audience? Not entirely, but I try to define any technical term the moment I use it, rather than assuming familiarity. Skipping that step is the fastest way to lose half the room in the first 2 minutes. Q4. How do you know if a piece of work actually meets criteria, rather than just seeming close enough? I go back to the original requirement and check it literally, not from memory. It's easy to convince yourself something meets criteria when you're proud of the effort behind it, even if it technically falls short. Q5. How do normal conditions differ from the edge cases people usually forget to plan for? Most plans work fine under normal conditions. It's the exceptions that expose weak design. I've started deliberately asking what happens when this goes wrong earlier instead of treating edge cases as an afterthought. Q6. What relevant factors do you consider before deciding a project is genuinely worth the stress it might cause? I weigh the expected outcome against what it'll cost the team, including how much it might reduce stress later versus how much it demands right now. If the final result doesn't feel extremely useful relative to that cost, it's usually a sign to scale the project down rather than push through. Underscore 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 underscore. Episode 10. Final Checks and Outcomes, Bosung. Q1. How does experimental data differ from data you just observe naturally? Experimental data comes from a situation you've deliberately controlled, so you can isolate one variable at a time. Observational data just captures whatever happens without that control, which makes cause and effect much harder to prove. Q2. Do you always carry out a formal risk assessment before starting something new? For anything with real stakes, yes. A proper risk assessment forces you to name the worst-case scenario out loud instead of just hoping it won't happen, and that alone changes how carefully people plan. Q3. When is statistical analysis actually necessary versus just eyeballing the numbers? Once a pattern isn't obvious at a glance, or the stakes are high enough that being wrong is costly, I bring in real statistical analysis rather than trusting intuition alone. Q4. How clearly do you define the desired outcome before starting a project? As specifically as possible early on. Without a clear desired outcome, It's surprisingly easy for a team to work hard for weeks and still disagree afterward about whether they actually succeeded. Q5. Are all steps in a research process equally important, or do some matter more? Honestly, no. Some steps are far more equally important in theory than they turn out to be in practice. A few decisions early on quietly determine everything that follows, while plenty of later steps are simply mechanical execution. Q6. What makes a method highly effective rather than just adequate? A highly effective method doesn't just work, it keeps working reliably as conditions change slightly, which is the part people usually forget to test for. Q7. How do you decide what counts as necessary information versus a nice-to-have? I ask what breaks if it's missing. If leaving something out doesn't actually block a decision, it's not truly necessary information, it's just comfortable to have. Q8. Does experience play a role in how quickly someone learns to trust or distrust their own analysis? Definitely, experience seems to play a role in exactly that. Early on, I trusted every clean-looking number. Now I've learned which kinds of results deserve a second, more skeptical look. Q9. When someone asks a follow-up question, how much detail should you provide details on the spot? Enough to answer honestly, but not so much that it derails the whole conversation. I try to provide details only as deep as the question actually calls for, and offer to go further afterward if someone wants it.